Somewhere beneath the sand, beneath the stone, beneath everything we think we know about the ancient world, there's a story that has been waiting thousands of years to be told. It is a story not about pharaohs, not about pyramids, not about the golden masks and painted tombs that fill our museums and dominate our imaginations. It is a story about what came before all of that, before the dynasties, before the crowns, before a single hieroglyph was ever carved into limestone. It is a story about the civilizations that made Egypt possible, and about how, one by one, each of them vanished from the face of the earth. Most people, when they think of ancient Egypt, picture a world that simply appeared, a civilization that emerged from the desert fully formed, already magnificent, already complex, already ancient. And that image is understandable. Egypt presents itself that way. It always has. The monuments are so enormous, the traditions so deep, the kings so confident in their own importance, that it feels almost impossible to imagine a world that existed before them. But that world did exist, and it was extraordinary. What the hieroglyphs reveal, not the famous hieroglyphs of Tutankhamun's tomb or Ramesses the Great's temple walls, but the oldest ones, the ones scratched onto bone tags in sealed burial chambers and etched into crude pottery in the centuries before there was even a unified Egypt, is that the Nile Valley had been home to organized, sophisticated, evolving human societies for at least 2,000 years before the first dynasty was born. 2,000 years of farming and trading and burying the dead with care. 2,000 years of building communities, developing rituals, crafting beautiful objects, and slowly, generation by generation, moving towards something they could not yet name, something that would eventually become the most enduring civilization in human history. There were 5 of them. 5 distinct cultures, each one rising and falling across the long arc of prehistory, each one leaving something behind that the next culture would inherit and transform. And when you follow that chain all the way to its end, you arrive at a pharaoh standing on the banks of the Nile, surveying a unified kingdom and believing, perhaps rightly, that he is the first of his kind. He is not. He is the last link in a chain that stretches back thousands of years into a world his own priests had already forgotten. The first of them appeared around 5,000 years before the Common Era, in the flat green stretch of the Nile Delta, where the great river fans out into dozens of channels before emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. This was not the Egypt that most people picture. There were no deserts here, or rather the desert was farther away, held back by the rich black soil that the Nile deposited every year when it flooded and retreated. The land was fertile, the air was humid. Reed marshes stretched for miles, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, a group of people built a village. They called their home something we no longer know. Archaeologists call it Merimde Beni Salama, after the modern Egyptian town near the site where the ruins were first discovered. The people who lived there have no name in history. They left no written records, no inscriptions, no monuments. What they left behind were the traces of ordinary life, the bones of cattle and goats, the seeds of emmer wheat and barley, the fragments of simple handmade pottery, and the shallow graves where they buried their dead, sometimes right beneath the floors of their own homes, as if they could not bear to be separated from the people they had loved. The Merimde culture was modest by any later standard. The houses were small oval structures built from mud and reed, clustered together in a way that suggests a genuine community rather than just a collection of isolated families. They raised animals, they grew crops, they fished the Nile, they traded with their neighbors, and slowly, over the course of nearly 1,000 years, they developed the kind of social habits, the shared rituals, the common practices, the unspoken agreements about how to live together, that are the invisible foundation of every civilization that ever existed. What is remarkable about the Merimde is not what they built, but what they started. They were the first people in the Nile Delta to make a settled life work at scale. Before them, the land had been home to wandering groups of hunter-gatherers who followed the seasons, and the animals. After them, it would never be fully wild again. They planted something in the Delta that would outlast them by millennia, not crops, but culture. The idea that the Nile Valley was a place where people could put down roots, build communities, and stay. The Merimde culture lasted for roughly 800 years. And then, quietly, without drama, without catastrophe, it faded. The village at Merimde Beni Salama was abandoned sometime around 4,200 years before the Common Era. The people did not leave behind any dramatic evidence of what happened. No burned houses, no massacre, no sudden disruption. They simply seemed to stop. And in their place, from the south, from Upper Egypt, came something new, something more dynamic, more complex, more ambitious. The Merimde people were absorbed into the great river of change that was flowing northward along the Nile. They were the first chapter. And like all first chapters, they existed mainly to make the second one possible. The second civilization appeared in Upper Egypt, the long, narrow corridor of fertile land that runs south from Cairo toward the first great cataract of the Nile. This was different terrain from the Delta, drier, more confined, hemmed in by limestone cliffs and desert plateaus on both sides. The people who settled here were farmers too, but they were farmers with ambition. They had copper, they had ritual, they had art, and they had a relationship with death that would echo through Egyptian civilization for the next 4,000 years. The Badarian culture, which takes its name from the town of al-Badari, where their remains were first identified, flourished from roughly 4,400 to 4,000 years before the Common Era. In the grand sweep of prehistory, this is a short window. 4 centuries, roughly the same length of time that separates us from Shakespeare. But in those 4 centuries, the Badarian people accomplished things that would have seemed extraordinary to any observer from the outside world. Their pottery alone sets them apart. The Badarian created a ceramic style that has never been equaled for the delicacy of its technique. Their signature black-topped red ware, vessels fired in a process that left the body of the pot a deep burnished red while the rim and interior turned jet black, required a level of skill and control that archaeologists still marvel at. These were not crude functional containers. They were works of art. And the fact that the Badarian chose to place tias, these beautiful objects in the graves of their dead, tells us something important about how they understood the world. They believed in something beyond death. They believed that the dead needed things, beautiful things, useful things, things that carried meaning. That belief would outlast them by thousands of years. The Badarian were also the first people in Egypt to use copper. Not in great quantities. Copper was rare and precious, and they mostly used it for small ornaments, pins and beads and rings. But the significance of this cannot be overstated. Copper is not found naturally in the Nile Valley in large amounts. To get it, you have to go to the Sinai, or to the Eastern Desert, or to trade partners who have access to those places. The presence of copper in Badarian graves means that these people were connected in networks of exchange that stretched hundreds of miles in every direction. They were not isolated. They were participants in a wider world, a world of trade and contact, and the slow diffusion of ideas across vast distances. And then, around 4,000 years before the Common Era, the Badarian culture came to an end. But this ending was not a death. It was a transformation. The Badarian did not disappear. They evolved. The next culture to emerge in Upper Egypt, the one archaeologists call Naqada Farn, or the Amratian, was built directly on the Badarian foundation. The pottery changed. The burial customs grew more elaborate. The communities grew larger, but the thread connecting them to what came before was unbroken. The Badarian were not conquered or destroyed. They became something else, something more. The third civilization is where things begin to accelerate. The Amratian culture, also known as Naqada, after the site of Naqada in Upper Egypt, where its remains were first systematically studied, emerged around 4,000 years before the Common Era, and lasted until approximately 3,500. And in those 5 centuries, the Nile Valley began to look, for the first time, like a place that was reaching towards something genuinely new. The Amratian people built better houses than their predecessors. Some of their dwellings had proper walls of wattle and daub, hearths for warmth and cooking, windbreaks outside the doorways to cut the desert wind. They expanded the practice of leaving grave goods with the dead, filling burial pits with pottery. Cosmetic palettes, ivory combs, carved figurines, and stone mace heads. Objects that carry enormous symbolic weight even today, because the mace head, that heavy stone-topped club, would become one of the most important symbols of royal power in all of pharaonic Egypt. The pottery of the Amratian period tells a richer story than the Badarian ceramics, not because it is more beautiful. The Badarian black-topped ware is in some ways more technically refined, but because it is more expressive. For the first time, the surfaces of vessels were decorated with images, animals mostly, wild bulls and hippopotamuses, ostriches and gazelles, the creatures of the desert and the river, but also boats, long, elegant river boats with multiple oars and raised cabins. The boat, in later Egyptian religion, would become one of the most sacred symbols of all, the vessel in which the sun traveled through the sky, the craft in which the dead journeyed to the afterlife. Here, 3,500 years before the pharaohs built their first pyramids, it was already appearing on the pottery of a village, people who had no name for what they were building. The social hierarchy visible in Amratian graves is more pronounced than anything seen in the Badarian or Merimde periods. Some burials are simple pit graves with a handful of objects. Others are elaborate, lined with wooden planks, filled with dozens of objects, the body of the deceased laid out with unmistakable care. This is the beginning of inequality as a visible material fact. The moment when some people in a community begin to accumulate more, control more, and be commemorated more richly after death than others. It is not yet kingship, but it is the shadow of kingship, falling across the Nile Valley for the first time. The Amratian culture ended not in collapse, but in growth. It grew into something bigger and more complex than itself. The next phase of the Naqada sequence, the culture that archaeologists call Naqada II, or the Gerzean. The transition was gradual, regional, messy in the way that all real historical change is messy. But the direction was clear. The Nile Valley was moving inexorably towards something it had never been before. The fourth civilization is the one that changes everything. The Gerzean culture, which flourished from approximately 3,500 to 3,200 years before the Common Era, is the moment when the Nile Valley stops being a collection of separate communities and starts becoming a world. The Gerzean people were traders, builders, administrators. They traveled, they imported, they organized, and they created, almost from nothing, the material foundations on which all of later Egyptian civilization would be built. Their reach was extraordinary. Gerzean artifacts, their distinctive pottery, their carved palettes, their lapis lazuli beads, have been found not only throughout Upper and Lower Egypt, but in Nubia to the south, in Canaan to the northeast, in the Eastern Desert, and in trade contexts that suggest contact with Mesopotamia, the other great river civilization developing at the same time, thousands of miles away on the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. The world, in the Gerzean period, was getting smaller. Ideas were moving faster. And the people who controlled the trade routes of the Nile Valley were getting richer and more powerful with every generation. Mud brick architecture appears in significant quantities for the first time in the Gerzean period. Not just houses, but larger structures. Storage facilities, perhaps religious buildings, perhaps the residences of people with enough wealth and power to command the labor of their neighbors. The settlements of the Gerzean period are larger than anything that came before. Hierakonpolis, in Upper Egypt, was by this time a substantial urban center, not a city in the modern sense, but a place with thousands of inhabitants, specialized crafts, a prominent religious cult, and the beginnings of a political hierarchy that would eventually produce something recognizable as a ruler. The Gerzean cosmetic palette, a flat, usually shield-shaped piece of grey-wakis stone used for grinding cosmetics, particularly the protective eye paint that Egyptians would use for thousands of years, begins to appear in elaborate carved forms during this period. These palettes are more than beauty tools. They are status objects, ritual objects, political objects. The most famous of them all, the Narmer palette, carved at the very end of the pre-dynastic period and widely considered one of the most important objects in the history of art, is a direct descendant of the simple palettes first developed in the Gerzean period. And then there's the writing, or rather the beginning of writing. The earliest known hieroglyphic inscriptions in Egypt appeared on Naqada III pottery vessels dated to approximately 3,200 years before the Common Era. But the proto-writing that preceded them, labels scratched onto bone tags found in elite burials at Abydos, administrative markings on sealed containers, symbols carved onto objects in ways that suggest systematic record-keeping, has its roots in the Gerzean period. The impulse to record, to mark ownership, to communicate across space and time through visual symbols, was already stirring in the Nile Valley by the middle of the 4th millennium before the Common Era. The Gerzean culture did not end. It became the final pre-dynastic phase, Naqada III, which in turn became the first dynasty of Egypt. The line between the 4th civilization and the beginning of Egypt proper is blurry, contested, and in some ways purely a matter of convention. The people who lived through that transition did not know they were crossing a historical threshold. They were simply doing what every generation before them had done, inheriting the world as they found it and trying to make it better. The 5th civilization is the most dramatic and the most tragic. It is also the most controversial, because for a long time, almost no one in the Western academic tradition knew it existed. Its story was buried, literally, beneath the waters of Lake Nasser, the vast artificial reservoir created in the 1960s when Egypt and Sudan built the Aswan High Dam. And by the time archaeologists had excavated what they could, the dam was already filling, and most of the evidence was already lost forever. The civilization is the A group, a term that archaeologists use for the culture that flourished in Lower Nubia, the stretch of the Nile Valley between the first and second cataracts, during roughly the same period that the Gerzean culture was developing in Upper Egypt. The A group people were not Egyptian. They were Nubian, in the loose sense of belonging to the broader cultural world south of Aswan. They raised cattle, they fished the Nile, they buried their dead in oval pit graves accompanied by extraordinarily fine pottery and imported goods, and they traded extensively and profitably with the Naqada cultures to their north. But the A group were not just traders. In their later phase, somewhere around 3,200 to 3,000 years before the Common Era, they were developing something that looks, in the archaeological record, remarkably like a state. Their elite burials grew larger and richer. Certain individuals were interred with quantities of goods that suggest enormous wealth and social power, not just the normal accumulation of a prosperous family, but the deliberate ceremonial commemoration of people who had commanded whole communities. And then, in 1964, a scholar named Keith Seal, excavating Cemetery L at the Nubian site of Kustul, pulled something extraordinary out of the ground. It was a limestone incense burner cracked and buried for 5,000 years. And when it was cleaned and reconstructed, it revealed something that stunned the archaeological community. These were pharaonic symbols, royal symbols, the symbols of a kingship tradition that was supposed to have originated in Egypt, and here they were on an object found in a Nubian tomb, dated to a period that may predate the earliest Egyptian use of the same symbols. The implications were revolutionary. If the Kustul incense burner meant what it appeared to mean, then the pharaonic tradition, the whole ideology of the god king, the divine ruler who embodied the power of the falcon, who unified the two lands, who was both mortal man and eternal deity, had not originated in Egypt. It had originated in Nubia. Or at the very least, it had developed simultaneously in both places, with Nubia contributing as much to the emerging concept of kingship as Egypt itself. The debate that followed was fierce and continues to this day. Later excavations at Abydos in Upper Egypt found evidence suggesting that Egyptian proto-dynastic tombs may predate the Kustul burner, rather than follow it, complicating the question of who influenced whom. Some scholars argued that the burner was an Egyptian-made object, imported into Nubia as a gift or tribute item, and that the Nubian elites who owned it were emulating Egyptian symbols rather than creating them. Others maintained that the evidence for a sophisticated Nubian political culture predating the First Dynasty was real and significant, even if the details of the Kustul burner's origins remained contested. What is not contested is what happened to the A group people. They were destroyed. Somewhere around 3,100 to 2,900 years before the Common Era, the rulers of Egypt's first dynasty, the same rulers who had just unified Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom, turned their attention southward. The A group were not the last Nubian civilization. They were followed centuries later by new groups, the C group, then the Kingdom of Kerma, then the Great Kingdom of Kush that would eventually conquer Egypt itself and rule as its 25th dynasty. Nubia would rise again, but the A group, that first flourishing of Nubian civilization, the culture that may have helped create the very idea of the pharaoh, was over. They had helped build something magnificent, and it had destroyed them. Now we need to sit with what this means. Because the story of these 5 civilizations is not simply an archaeological curiosity, it is a fundamental challenge to the way we think about the origins of one of the greatest cultures in human history. We tend to think of civilizations as eruptions, sudden appearances of complexity in a world that was previously simple. Egypt appears in this view as a kind of miracle, a place where writing and monumental architecture and complex religion and centralized government all emerged together, almost overnight, from a void. But that is not what happened. What happened was a slow accumulation, a long conversation across centuries between farmers and traders and artists and priests and chiefs and maybe kings, all building on what the people before them had made. The Merimde people figured out how to farm the delta and build communities in the floodplain. The Badarian people figured out how to work copper and how to bury the dead in ways that honored something beyond the merely physical. The Amratian people developed the imagery, the boats, the animals, the cosmic symbols, that would become the vocabulary of Egyptian religion. The Gerzean people built the trade networks and the administrative systems and the monumental prestige objects, the carved palettes, the mace heads, that would become the tools of Egyptian kingship. And the Nubian A group may have contributed to the very idea of the divine ruler, the god king who unites heaven and earth, that would define Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. None of this reached the history books written by the ancient Egyptians themselves. The pharaohs were not interested in what came before them, not because they were ignorant, but because they were ideologically committed to the idea that civilization began with them. They were the first. They were the products of divine creation, not human evolution. The gods had established the order of the world, and the pharaoh embodied that order, and everything before was formless darkness. But the hieroglyphs do not lie. The oldest of them, the bone tags and pottery marks and rock carvings, tell a different story. They tell us that the symbols the Egyptians used to describe their world were not invented overnight. They were accumulated, one generation at a time, across a vast span of prehistory by people who had no idea they were building towards something that would last forever. There is something both humbling and magnificent in that realization. Humbling because it reminds us that nothing great in human history is ever truly the creation of a single person or a single moment. Every magnificent achievement is built on thousands of years of smaller achievements, most of them anonymous, most of them forgotten, most of them visible only to the archaeologist with a brush and a trowel, and the patience to sit in the desert and listen to what the earth has to say. And magnificent, because it tells us that the impulse that built Egypt, the desire to organize human life in a way that goes beyond survival, to create beauty and meaning and order in a chaotic world, is not something that belongs to one culture or one moment in time. It is something that was present in the Nile Valley for thousands of years before anyone carved a pharaoh's name in stone. It is something that the Merimde farmer and the Badarian potter and the Gerzean trader all shared with the builders of Karnak and the scribes of the Book of the Dead. The five civilizations before Egypt did not fail. They succeeded so completely that their success became invisible. They built the world that Egypt inherited, and in doing so, they built, without knowing it, without intending it, without ever seeing the result, the longest-lived civilization in the history of the world. The sand covered them. The Nile rose and fell for 5,000 years above their bones. And then the archaeologists came, with their brushes and their tools and their endless, patient curiosity, and began to uncover what was always there. Consider for a moment what was lost when the Aswan High Dam was built. Consider what it means that the cemeteries of Kustul, those astonishing tombs with their royal pottery and their contested incense burner, now lie permanently beneath the waters of Lake Nasser. The archaeologists who worked there in the 1960s knew they were racing against a deadline that could not be moved. They dug as fast as they could, documented what they could find, and then stepped back and watched the water rise. Whatever answers remained in the ground, whatever evidence might have definitively settled the question of who influenced whom, whether the A-group Nubians were the originators of pharaonic ideology or merely its admirers, is now sealed beneath 40 meters of water, beyond the reach of any future excavation, lost to humanity forever. This is not an abstraction. This is a real and permanent erasure of the past. And it happened not in some distant barbaric age, but in living memory in the 1960s, as the modern world congratulated itself on its technological mastery over the natural environment. We built a dam to control the Nile, the same Nile whose annual flood had sustained the Badarian and the Amratian and the Gerzean and everything that came after. And in doing so, we drowned the evidence of 5,000 years of human civilization. The civilizations that preceded Egypt understood the river's power in their bones. The Merimde farmers who built their village in the delta knew that their homes were only as permanent as the river allowed. The Badarian people who placed their dead in graves near the floodplain knew that the Nile could rise and reclaim those graves. And yet they stayed. They built anyway. They buried their dead with care and love and beautiful pottery because they believed that what they were doing mattered, even if the Nile might someday wash it all away. That faith, that deeply human conviction that the things we build and create and believe in are worth building and creating and believing in, even in the face of impermanence, is perhaps the most important legacy of the five civilizations before Egypt. It left no grand inscriptions, no stone monuments dedicated to their glory. It left only its consequences, and the consequences were extraordinary. We know now, from the archaeology of the past century, and especially of the past few decades, that the pre-dynastic period of Egypt was far richer and more complex than anyone imagined even 50 years ago. New excavations at Hieroglyphs, Abydos, and Nakada have revealed that mummification was practiced as early as 3,500 years before the Common Era. That enormous brewing facilities were already operating in the same period, producing beer as currency, as ritual offering, as social glue. That the symbolic vocabulary of the later Egyptian religion, the falcon, the serpent, the solar disk, the paired crowns, was developed and refined across the entire pre-dynastic sequence, not suddenly invented at the moment of unification. The story of pre-dynastic Egypt is not only an Egyptian story, it is a Nile Valley story. It involves the people of Nubia just as much as the people of Upper and Lower Egypt. It involves traders who crossed the eastern desert carrying lapis lazuli and gold. It involves pastoralists moving toward the Nile as the Sahara dried, bringing their cattle and their cosmological ideas and their burial customs with them. The Egypt that eventually emerged was not a purely indigenous creation. It was a synthesis, a magnificent, unlikely world historic synthesis of ideas and peoples from across the ancient world, all concentrated along the gift of the Nile. When you stand before a hieroglyphic inscription and try to decode its meaning, you are not just reading the words of a scribe who lived 3,000 years ago. You are reading the end product of a process that began 7,000 years ago, with farmers scratching marks onto clay and potters painting symbols onto vessels. Every sign in the hieroglyphic script, the falcon, the eye, the reed, the water, carries within it the memory of everything that came before the moment it was formally used. Every pharaoh who ever sat on the throne of Egypt was, whether he knew it or not, the inheritor of a legacy that stretched back into a darkness his own tradition had chosen not to remember. That darkness is lifting now, slowly, imperfectly, incompletely, but lifting. The five civilizations before Egypt are coming back into focus, and as they do, the picture of Egypt itself changes. It becomes more human, more connected, more real. Because the deepest truth about Egypt, the truth that all the gold and all the stone and all the divine proclamations were designed to obscure, is that it was made by people, ordinary, fallible, hopeful, creative people who were trying to make sense of the world and their place in it, one generation at a time, across thousands of years of effort and failure and discovery and loss. The pharaohs were not gods. They were the culmination of a very long human story. And that story, as stories always do, began long before its most famous chapter. The story was never lost. It was only buried. And now, at last, we are learning to read it.